Good morning, everybody. Sorry we're just a bit late, as you can imagine. Those who know me, that's my fault. Before I forget, because I'll forget once I get into our topic today, which is healing our wounded American culture, we are excited to announce that the theme next year for adult faith formation is prayer and discernment. Prayer is so important to our life of faith, and discernment is so important, the discernment of the Spirit of God and discernment of the will of God. It's something that our Jesuit Pope, Pope Francis, has spoken and taught and preached about quite a bit. And so we're going to be focusing on prayer and discernment in our life of faith coming up beginning in September. Before I delve into our topic for today, I want to summarize and provide a bridge to our talk from last week on the resurrection appearances. Our modern popes have been powerful witnesses to Christ because they have encountered Christ personally. They have experienced the light of the risen Christ such that they can see clearly, including the problems of modern culture, and also shepherd well, despite their own respective limitations and weaknesses, which they would note. And so it really comes from the light and that encounter with the risen Christ. We hear on Christmas Day beautiful words from the prologue of John's Gospel. Listen to these words. "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we saw his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." In these short verses, we recognize the fullness of the faith and its dynamic. Christ is the source of grace and truth. The two dimensions of our faith, life with God, which is the effective dimension of our faith, living with God, and also the substance of our faith, what we believe, the content of our faith. Both dimensions of our Catholic faith, the affective relationship with the living God, and the substance of what we believe fit hand in glove. Nurturing these two related dimensions of our Catholic faith, grace and truth, has been a hallmark of our modern popes. And as I said last week, it flows from their encounter with the risen Christ and their experience of the light of the risen Christ and the wisdom of God. I wrote Sunday's homily yesterday in the morning light of my deck, which faces east in the morning, and this talk in the morning light of this morning, which was a beautiful morning until my neighbor down below started talking with her neighbor, and so then I went inside to finish my talk. Now, why do I mention this? I think light is an important metaphor for this talk as we delve into our wounded American culture. We have deprived ourselves of the light of God as a nation, as citizens, as people. And so we are walking in darkness. We're walking like the disciples on the road to Emmaus the wrong way. We're walking away from the east, away from Jerusalem. I'd like to do 5 things briefly in a short time, which I'll describe in a few minutes, and then conclude with Christian hope. But I also want to take some time to introduce the Faith Formation Year, which I did, because I thought I might forget it. Last week, I pointed to the opening lines of a seminal introductory document of Pope Benedict XVI, God is love, Deus caritas est. And what he says is that our Christian faith is not about a lofty ideal or an ethic, but rather Christianity is about an encounter with an event, the incarnation of God, with a person, the person of Jesus Christ, which gives life a new horizon and a definitive direction. Today, to set the stage for what follows, I'd like to quote from the opening lines from Pope Francis, his first major document, and like Pope Benedict, lines from the very beginning of that document called The Joy of the Gospel. This is what the Pope says. "The great danger in today's world, pervaded as it is by consumerism, is the desolation and anguish born of a complacent yet covetous heart, the feverish pursuit of frivolous pleasures and a blunted conscience. He then goes on, whenever our interior life becomes caught up in its own interests and concerns, there is no longer room for others. There is no place for the poor. Now, I can remember beautifully Tom Johnson, my friend, parishioner here, former county attorney at Hennepin County, when he received the Lifetime Achievement Award, or it was entitled something else at Hennepin County. We were all there as friends and family. He quoted this passage from Pope Francis among all of his colleagues, secular faith colleagues, whoever they were, because he was so moved by this truth. Pope Francis nails it here, just as Pope Benedict XVI did at the beginning of Deus Caritas. Asked, I want to say amen, right? Brother Francis. This is the heart of the matter. How would St. Augustine say it? He might say it another way. Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. So desolation, if that doesn't happen, and anguish we feel, is existential. So we seek to numb the pain rather than seek the one, the only one who can heal us, who can heal our hearts and give us that true encounter with the living God and that true decisive direction and new horizon. This is the only way that we experience this. We do not turn to God often in our culture and in our lives, and thus our deep cultural wounds persist in the United States and in our lives as well. The wounded American culture results from a lack of oxygen. We are not breathing with the air of God, the air of God's wisdom and truth, and a lack of the blood that comes from the heart, right? Jesus Christ's sacred heart, the divine heart of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So we become sick. We become anemic, lethargic. And to borrow Pope Francis's astute phrase, we need antibodies of justice and charity, he says, and I would add, truth and grace, so that we might be healed and begin life anew. So enough of the preface. I'll sketch out the present circumstances, number one, of our American culture. Number two, point to some underlying causes of where we are. Number three, employ the wisdom of several contemporary American voices and one 20th century German theologian. Then offer a critique of my own of the American voices, add my own contribution, and then end with Christian hope. And we're going to do this all by 10 to 12, because I promised you 30 minutes. So I'm going to do the best I can. Okay, number one point. It started out so well for the United States. I really believe that. And there's been a lot of good that America has brought to immigrants seeking a better life, fighting the First World War and World War II, which Catholic Church would teach were just causes, and then just building in so many positive ways, a generous spirit in so many ways. But we've also struggled and mightily of late, and we'll talk about that. But it started out well with the Declaration of Independence, a transcendent foundation to our new republic, our Republican democracy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? These are essential to human flourishing, what it means to be human, what it means to be a republic, what it means to promote the common good. Now, many of the framers understood that in order to use this broad grant of freedom, capacious grant of freedom, if you will, Americans needed a robust role for religion to help cultivate civic virtue. They did not envision religion relegated and sent out of the public square, which is the current understanding and trajectory of secularism. That was not the understanding of the framers. Why? Because they knew that this broad grant of freedom could only work if religion played a role cultivating the virtue of its citizens, such that freedom was used well in a way consistent with nature and the common good. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French philosopher, underscored this point, often in his writings, especially in Democracy in America. Our transcendent beginnings articulated through the Declaration of Independence would need the grace of God and religion in the lives of the citizens, so we would use that grant of freedom well. Now, the other part where we start off on such good footing is in our Constitution, in the sense that you have both federalism and the separation of powers, both oriented to the common good, understanding that the real power in America comes from the people. We are the source, we are the sovereign, and that power comes from us. And our Constitution really preserves that in a powerful way. Now, we have been the source of good in many ways, but we've also gotten off track. And so I want to trace our current landscape in some notable ways. And it's going to sound like the via negativa, but I'm naming the harm and I'm trying to be honest here. We got to confront the reality. Number one, religious participation is at an all-time low in the United States, and it's dropping precipitously. Number two, the growing gulf between the rich and the poor widens daily, and it offends God's sense of justice. The goods of the land are meant for all, and it is not tenable. Last summer, when we set out the faith formation schedule, I chose this topic to end the year because I had been sensing that our current course is not sustainable as a culture. Something had to give, right? It is not sustainable, and I'll point to the voices who also hold that view. Now, the pandemic has allowed us an opportunity to hit reset if we choose to do that, and I hope we do. Number three, we have deaths of despair that occur every day through opioid crisis, other addiction, mass shootings, which is absolutely, we are an outlier in the Western civilization, suicide. These are deaths of despair when people have no hope, right? Because we've lost that sense of transcendence. Number four, we are addicted to our electronic devices, right? I have a hard time even turning them off on a Sunday afternoon or evening. And we don't even begin to know the effect that this has on our minds and psychological well-being, including our young people, right? And that is a really challenging reality. Number five, we have rising divorce rates, less young people getting married, and a declining birth rates. There's a book that I don't reference in my list, but I would reference now, Coming Apart by Charles Murray. He's a really good sociologist, and he paints a very challenging picture about the two Americas. We live in two different Americas. I see it when I go to northwestern Wisconsin and spend time here in Minneapolis, completely different Americas. Number six, we are a penal country. Our imprisonment rate, again, like mass shootings, is a complete outlier in the Western world. We are creating underclasses of people who suffer. We are a very penal nation, and that has taken a great toll. Our country, number seven, continues to see deep trends of racial injustice, including here in Minnesota. Some of the greatest racial disparities in the country exist here in Minnesota. We have to confront this as a community. And so we also see through the pandemic that deep inequities have been exposed in healthcare. Those who are in minorities who are often working in service industries and literally cannot do anything but work to feed their families. And so you see these effects being laid bare in this time of crisis. Harsh polarization between Republicans and Democrats, people who literally live in two different worlds and seemingly can't even speak to each other, a government that increasingly doesn't work. And then finally, I would add to this, and a colleague from Catholic Studies in St. Paul noted this, who's like me, a centrist both politically and in terms of Catholic ecclesiology. He said, how about this? We have some of the most barbaric abortion laws vis-a-vis Europe in the Western world, and some of the most restrictive grant of health care vis-a-vis Europe. So we're getting it wrong on one end at the beginning of life by these barbaric laws, including in New York and other places, or life in the womb, and then we get it wrong on the other end when people are sick and suffering. That is not a culture, friends, that is sustainable. So you might say to yourselves, gee, Father, aren't you supposed to come back from sabbatical more upbeat and refreshed? Yes, and I have, although we've entered back into this challenging time. But I really believe we have to name the harm. These are the wounds. These are the manifestations of a wounded American culture. And it is sad, but we have to name it. So we don't just turn away from it and continue to numb ourselves. So what do we do as a result? We focus, right? This is what happens. We focus on comfort. We focus on things, or as the writers say, that which is below. We focus on the material world. We numb the pain. We anesthetize ourselves. We sleepwalk through life. We suffer the anguish and desolation of an unfulfilled heart. And that is the experience of so many Americans. How did we get here? So this is my second point. How did we get here? What are some of the causes? I texted my classmate, Monsignor Guion up in North Dakota, who's a wise man, a good friend of mine since seminary, and I asked him for his take, and it was very similar to my take. I said, what do you think about this? And he said, seems like light fare for a Sunday. And then he talked about, he sent me a description of Russia, when Russia descends into communism. And they look back on this and they say, how did this happen? And one wise man, a man of faith, said, we forgot about God. Our country, which had religious roots, Russia, forgot about God. And so that privation, that lack, that hole, then gets filled with something else. It gets filled with the state. It gets filled with might equals right. It gets filled with materialism, whatever it might be. And so then we take that course and we walk the other way. So that's the first thing and most important thing, is we are not walking with God. We are not allowing ourselves to experience the transcendent truth of God and the light of God. Number two, and relatedly, we also have forgotten about who we are, the truth of our anthropology, or to put it more clearly, theological anthropology, the nature of the human person through the light of faith and reason that comes from our understanding of nature. And firstly, we are human beings who are transcendent. We have souls. We are made for God. We are supposed to walk with God and worship God. We have an eternal destiny, a teleos, a goal. But if we live in a way not consistent with that, we will suffer and we will walk the wrong way. We've forgotten who we are. And that has led to mistakes in law. It's allowed us to make what we think are advancements in technology and biomedical areas that are not consistent with the dignity of the human person and our nature. Thirdly, we've misunderstood what true freedom is. Freedom is not license to do whatever we like. That ends in misery, right? That's what Hobbes and some of the people in the Enlightenment believed, right? Maximize pleasure, minimize pain. No, those sovereign masters, as he calls them, are also called to be put in check with reason and faith and the light of both, to understand that freedom is given by God for the good, to choose God and to choose consistently with who we are, the good of our human nature. That's when we experience the freedom of Christ, the freedom that Paul talks about. Number four, the dictatorship of relativism. This is the very pithy and accurate way that Pope Benedict described this a week before he was elected Pope in 2005. Pope Francis has continued this phrase in his writings, and he gets accused wrongly and ignorantly of not promoting objective truth. That could not be further from the truth. Both believe that there is a dictatorship of relativism. What does that mean? That through mistakes in liberal democracy and liberalism in the philosophic sense, we do not grasp that there are objective truths, that there are things that are objectively true, and that we're called to follow and orient our lives to those objective truths. And that's where happiness and true freedom are found, and to use our freedom to serve God and our neighbor. So it sounds pretty dark. I'll get to the light, and I certainly don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend to, but I've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of praying down in South Texas, and this is some of what I've been thinking about. So what is the result of this folly, really this madness, to traverse apart from the light of God? Disenlightenment. Our own Matt Gulseth, I think, has used this term. Actually, what was brought to us at the Enlightenment really ended in disenlightenment, because we did not allow the integration of faith and reason to continue. Faith had no room because it can't be verifiable, so it doesn't play a part. That was a big mistake. And what happens, to borrow a metaphor from Pope Benedict XVI, we enter into a windowless bunker where we seek to do our lawmaking, our government, our policy, our decisions with regard to technology, and we are deprived from the light of faith and reason. Secondly, I would describe it as a disintegration of culture. Rather than flourish and develop as an American culture, we fail to embrace the true meaning of nature, of freedom, of the human person, and our failure to be guided by the light of truth results in this disintegration of culture. The world that we are experiencing is laid bare at this time of crisis. And what I'm going to do is put a number of these sources that I'm going to refer to. I'll send them to Julie Craven either later today or tomorrow morning. And you can access the things that I'm going to point to. And I've got about 7 minutes left, so I've got to keep moving here. And I will get to the light and the hope. So hang there with me if you would. So one other thing I would point to as a cause to our current crisis is elitism. So what do I mean by that? Well, you see this kind of bifurcation of those who have power and those who do not. And what happens is those who have power exercise the power not in a way of true service, but in a way that separates the gap between those who have made it and those who haven't. Charles Murray alludes to this in a sociological way. What happens when we see elitism in government, a government that doesn't work for the people? We see it in finance. We see it in big business, in Hollywood, right? They know better, and they often tell you so. We see it in church. How about bishops living an insular life of authority without the light of those around them? Now, the opposite of that is our humble shepherd, Archbishop Hebda, who's inclusive and not insular. He was just out blessing old folks at the old folks' home yesterday. But we've seen it too often, church leaders who are insular. Francis is not insular, and so therefore he exercises his authority as true service and in freedom. And so what do we see in all of these areas? That elitism, I know better and I'm going to hold the power, results in a populist backlash. That's where we're at the present moment. It's understandable when you deprive folks of rightful authority, the authority that comes from them. Okay, a couple of figures and then we'll wrap it up here in 5 minutes. The only one that I don't critique is Romano Guardini. He was a 20th century German philosopher, brilliant, one of the most prophetic voices in the Catholic faith in the 20th century. So he's coming out of the Second World War, the horrors of the totalitarian Nazi regime, and he writes a book called The End of the Modern World, and it is truly prophetic. It's one of the things I dug into on sabbatical. And what he does is he says, we are going to try to change nature rather than live our lives in accord with nature. And he prophesizes a technocratic paradigm where we become enslaved. And what he says, and one of the best things he says, is true power is understood as service. And who are we reminded of? Jesus on the cross, the one who came to save us, to serve us. At the Last Supper, he washed the feet of his disciples. When you think of spousal relationships, to serve each other as Christ has served us. As a pastor, I'm called to serve you as Christ has served us. Government, same. They're called to serve the common good. And that's the true understanding of power. Secondly, Patrick Deneen, a Notre Dame political philosopher. He was at Georgetown for a while. He wrote a book, fascinating work, really well done, Why Liberalism Failed. And his thesis is that it couldn't help but fail because of some of the internal issues. He says liberalism has failed because and he's talking again political philosophically, it misunderstands freedom, it forgets the nature of the human person, and therefore results in excesses in moral license to do whatever we like on the moral theological side, and in terms of on the economic side, to exalt the markets without restraining the markets. So you have a broad grant of freedom in each area that is really libertarian, and it results as a pincher movement on the conservative and the liberal side, resulting in a deleterious effect on the common good. And both liberals and conservatives are blind, he says, to this misuse of freedom and this misunderstanding of freedom. The citizen, American citizens, are the true protagonist. We are called to be the center of American life, the center of economic life, and what happens is we end up serving the state and serving the economy rather than the other way around. Thus the populist backlash. Authority and power are not used for authentic service, but self-interest. Boy, don't we see that in politics quite frequently. Brené Brown, really talented social professor of social work at the University of Texas in Houston, visiting professor at the University of Texas at Austin in management. Check this out, and we'll have Julie, if she would, put it up on the website. She does a TED Talk on the power of vulnerability. I watched it the other day. I've heard about it. It was really, really well done, and very much resonated with my experience of Christian conversion, what it means to really enter into a life of service. It's really, really well done, about 28 minutes. And she says when people live in true vulnerability with friends and family, even with coworkers, in a way that's prudently vulnerable, what happens is they live in a way that is full-hearted. They live in a way that is full-hearted. They can live this life of goodness, and I would say goodness to God and neighbor. She has a great thing that Julie sent me, Julie Craven, a great quote about the pandemic that says, I hope we don't go back to the pre-pandemic way of life. This didn't work for us. And she sketches out a number of things that I've done as well. So we'll put that quote up as well. Ross Douthat, conservative Catholic commentator, get this, who writes for the Sunday New York Times. He's got a weekly column that I've followed since he was 30. He's now 40. Brené Brown is 54. Deneen is 55. And Guardini is dead. So I don't know what age he is. I think he's in eternal heaven, I imagine. So Douthat is 40 and really, really bright, maybe the brightest Catholic of his generation. He writes The Decadent Society. Just came out, and he talks about American society and says we are the victim of our own success. And so what happens is he says, like Rome, which did not see a precipitous decline, but a long decline. And he says what's striking about the Roman Empire is not that it fell, but that it took so long. And what happens is we live in affluence, but he says we live in a time where there is no innovation. We are declining in birth rates, we're declining in the way we used to contribute to the world in innovative ways. We've certainly seen this in evidence in the time of crisis with the pandemic. And so I would call your attention to that as well. Now, one of the things that he says, interestingly, Douthat, is he can't envision what is going to take us off that course of the decadent American culture. And he's using decadent in a very nuanced way, and you can check it out. He says in a podcast in late February on someone else's podcast, he says, well, maybe this pandemic will be the thing that puts us on the right course or takes us off this course of decadence. And I think he might be right. Charles Camosy. Charlie Camosy is a Christian ethicist, biomedical ethicist at Fordham University, another Catholic. These are all Catholic, except I don't know if Brene Brown is Catholic. He is a really wonderful theologian, a centrist. He has a new book out called The Throwaway American Culture. And he says we need to combat the throwaway culture, and he's borrowing Pope Francis's descriptive line, with a culture of accompaniment and a culture of inclusion, where we live a consistent life ethic from the womb all the way through life's continuum. And this is so true. He quotes in the opening chapter Archbishop Gomez, the new president of the Conference of Catholic Bishops, who says, there were never any one-issue saints, right? Saints were not one-issue saints. They cared for all of God's creation, including the created world. St. Francis would testify to that as well. So permit me a few more minutes. I'm going to go over a little bit because I got a lot here, but I'm just about done. All of them agree that our present course is deleterious to the common good and represent an anti-culture that needs to be, they would say, avoided or subverted or lived in a way that doesn't engage it in particular ways. And I'm doing this quickly, so I don't want to miss critique. There are other voices as well that you can turn to. Michael Hanby, we're going to put his false paradigm up on our website as well, and Rod Dreher's Benedict option, our other looks at our current culture. So what's my critique and contribution? I don't have a critique of Father Romano Guardini. I think he absolutely gets it right. With the others, they all get it right, in my opinion, that there is something significantly wrong with our American culture, that we are on the wrong path. I agree with them that it is an anti-culture, a culture that rather than produce human flourishing and promote the common good, is in some cases producing harm, and in other cases not producing human flourishing. But here's a common failure among all of them, which is understandable given their work. They stay in the life of the mind rather than entering into the life of the spirit. None of them, in the way that I think they should, account for God's grace and God's providence. All of them, in some ways, capitulate to the monolith of secularism as if there is no way out. And I think that's a failure of imagination. That's a poverty of imagination. They do not account for God's providence and grace, that God can restore us. In some senses, it's almost a deist move, thinking that rather than God being in the world, still able to restore us, as all of salvation history and Scripture attest, that somehow we got to do a workaround. I would say the popes and Father Guardini, and this priest as well, say, no way. Lean into God's grace. With God's grace, recreate culture. Restore culture to its authentic sense, such that it contributes to life. Don't give up. Now, what I would say is they're not as much into the interior life, accounting for the fact that we need conversion. We need Christians living a deep life. Now, they may live that in their own lives, but there isn't enough testimony to what can happen when the life of the Spirit, or as Pope Francis says in that opening quote, the interior life is attended to. Now, with Brene Brown, I'd say true vulnerability is understood at the cross when Jesus gives his life for us. And the throwaway culture has to be founded in a spiritual way on a life with God, which can't but help to see the needs and goodness of our neighbor. Now, what's my one meager contribution? I would say this: unhealed wounds in the heart are something that contribute harm not only to persons' lives, but to communities, to families, to workplaces, to our country. Christ seeks to heal us. He seeks to make us whole, to transform us and restore us, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And I think that's a really important dimension of the way back, not only for the church, which needs cultural conversion, but our nation, which seeks cultural conversion as well. We need Christians who have been healed by Christ so that we can help heal this culture. And that brings me to my final point, and I'm a little bit over time, about 6 minutes. So next time I speak, I'm going to give those 6 minutes back to you. We end with hope and light, which is our hope and light in Christ. And I think the key is to build a civilization of love. This is what my colleague, Professor Gonstead, says at St. Thomas. She's from Venezuela, and she's a wonderfully gifted woman. To build that civilization of love, which the Catholic Catechism calls us to. We believe that God's Word and the light of the risen Christ can rebuild our culture, can rebuild society. But here's the final point. The only way that it happens, friends, is Christians who have been transformed by Christ, who have been converted by Christ. A lukewarm, apathetic American culture that is wounded is not going to be transformed by lukewarm, apathetic Christians. It's not going to happen. So the only way that we can set the world ablaze with the love of God, like St. Francis and Therese of Lisieux and St. John the Baptist did in an extraordinary way, is to allow Christ to heal our wounded hearts, to allow the light of Christ to be a source of grace and truth in our lives. And that's where I think we need to go in this humble opinion of this priest. God bless you. We'll see you next time. We are going to have some faith formation opportunities throughout the summer. Susan Stabile and I have talked about doing a book club, and we'll be working with Sarah and Josh to try to bring you more live-streamed opportunities. Again, 3 months on sabbatical, so I had a lot to throw at you. Thanks for the extra minutes, and you're out of here by